as I said, Chris, it'll probably take me a bit, but we'll get this up onto the Facebook page as a link, so other instructors can get to it. Of course, time zone wise, this is a tough thing to do. I'm going to enable screen sharing, Chris, so that you can share your PowerPoint when you're ready. Let me just start with introductions. Chris and I met in 2000, but at the time I was so drunk that I don't remember it. This is just testimony. So we were we were at an international guide dog federation conference. Chris is at that time. Chris did not even have one PhD, so he's just accumulating PhDs ever since. He's also a really good guitar player, and one of the more experienced guide dog instructors in the world, having had a hard time keeping jobs. He's worked all over Australia for GDBA in the UK, and also in Hong Kong, I think not too long ago. So he's been around for a bit. And his interest and his PhD is in the emotions experienced by guide dog users as they move through the process. And I was fortunate to hear an early presentation of this several years ago, and delighted I heard this presentation this past summer in Vancouver at the IGDF, and I think it's very well suited both to guide dog instructors and to mobility instructors as they look at people coming into the pipeline or through even coming out the other side of this process. So, Chris, with no more introduction than that, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much. Let me just get this thing set up for you, and we'll pretty much go from there. Okay, I hope you can see my screen now.
I can. I think we can see both the current slide and we're looking at, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Firstly, thank you very much, Lucas, for the introduction and for inviting me along to this meeting. I'm looking forward to it. I hope it's of value to you. If it's not, turn off now and go and watch NCIS or something. But I'm going to rattle through this because it's about an hour's presentation, but I wanted to give some time for questions and shared experiences at the end of this. You know, Lucas is right. My learning is all about how much we share the information, and internationally is always exciting for me when I see these opportunities. So I'll start off by just saying the title of this is called The Emotions Experienced by Blind and Vision Impaired People in the Application, Training and Working of Their Guide Dogs. Or really the alternate title is probably more useful. It's the information that an application form won't gather for you. I'm Chris Muldoon, and this is Adelaide in South Australia, which is where I used to live. It's beautiful. It's got stunning beaches and lots of hills and mountains. Great place to work. And this is Scotland. This is where I live now. I am Scottish. And this is what they'd like you to believe, that it's full of castles and hills and glens. But I'm afraid this is the reality. I spend a lot of my time freezing. So in the introduction, I just want to mention that in 2022, I finished a couple of PhDs. So they're both running in tandem together, but they're both PhDs on the same subject, looking at the emotional connection we have with our clients and they have with their journey into guide dog mobility. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because it raises questions for me, and it always has raised questions for me about our clients' emotions and how we have and what we have to do in order to be able to be of some support to them. And that's regardless of where they are in the journey, whether they're at the beginning of the journey, where they've just come in contact with the organization, or on all the ways through that. So here we go. The overview of this presentation will really talk about what are emotions, and how do they impact on a person with sight loss. I'm going to share an experience I had with a client, two clients actually, Jack and Roz. And then I'm going to tell you why I did a PhD, because if you can give me a better answer, I'll take it. And then a closer look at emotions again, and then the value and significance of those emotions, and what it means when we're collecting information from the client to understand that, and then applying that information to the practice of what we do. And then really I'm going to wind up from there so that we can have a bit of a chat. So I hope this video comes through. Let me know if it doesn't, so somebody can tell me if it's not working through. But what are emotions? Here's a short video. So that little video might well raise some emotions for you, because we all have them, that some more than others. And in some cases, if the baby laughing might bring up some emotions for you, especially if you have children. I don't have children, so it doesn't bring up any emotional value for me. It may bring up some memories of happy times, and therefore that's an emotion in itself, one of happiness. It may be, if your child is a teenager now, a sense of achievement or pride, or if you're at the office and your teenager is at home, a sense of fear and panic and anxiety as to wondering what they're getting up to. But whatever the response is, it shows that emotions are related to experience, and whatever we experience can trigger an emotion. That's especially true when you look at other emotions. So here are some pictures of other emotions. These people have got a range of them. I'm especially like the upset person. That's just one of my favorites, because I probably relate to it. And then just to show how poor we are in our communications of emotions, we've had to design emotions that fit onto our phone to show how emotional we are. So with the images that show how you're feeling. Emotions can be based on modeling behavior. So you can see this young person is modeling what he's seeing the adult do. And that's probably an emotion of frustration or frustration is called that. Collective emotions, we can all experience them as a group. This is probably a sporting event, and I'll give you an example of that. This is the famous Glasgow Celtic playing the famous Glasgow Rangers, and Celtic have just scored. So the goalkeeper lying on the ground has got a very clear emotion of frustration, anger, and disappointment. The crowd, if you can just see them behind, they're nonplussed. The Celtics players are very emotional, they're very happy, and so am I, because I'm a Celtic supporter. And then finally, there's a picture of a young boy cuddling a very beautiful black Labrador, and his face is giving off emotions too. But just for a second, have a look at the young boy's face. His emotions are very difficult to assess what he's actually feeling. We are projecting that he must be feeling very good because the dog is in the picture. So there's a relationship there. Some facts about emotions that we need to consider when we're working with our clients. We have lots of them, and they take different shapes, and they intersperse with each other. We react to the emotions of others at various times. We move through that environment of emotional well-being constantly, all the time. We need emotions to continue to reinforce how we feel about things and events and people, and what those emotions will trigger for us and make us respond to them. Feelings can be brought on by emotions too. So emotions don't necessarily have to have a feeling attached to them, but if you're feeling something, it could well be an emotional response. And then as we're going through that, understanding emotions is a very complex skill for us too. It's not just something that comes naturally in our development, that we are experts in understanding emotional conditions. When we work with clients, understanding their emotions can be quite difficult at times too, because they may portray emotions that we are trying to detect that maybe are not what they're actually saying, unless they actually come out and say it. Clients' emotions can be linked to their experience, so they can experience things that we've got no connection with that they have, and that bubbles through in the relationships that we have with them. And then they can also be connected at various time periods or temporality-based emotions. So they can be related to past events and present events and future events. So, and particularly with our clients, past events have a huge impact on their emotional states. Like losing your sight, that's a fairly significant emotional state to be in. Like having any sort of disability, like not being able to communicate because of your disability, or not being able to communicate well to people who don't have your disability. Like having a deteriorating sight loss condition. That's not losing your sight, that's the process of losing your sight over a period of time. And then it's also an emotional experience losing independence, because your independence is related to how you feel at a number of other emotional levels. So for things like we may not be able to recognize the people that we see or love, and that creates an emotional response in us. We may not be able to drive or read or move around safely in the environment anymore, and that's an emotional experience. And we may be having an emotional experience in applying for any sort of mobility training, including using a guide dog, because it moves you from one stage of your life into another. And it's an emotional experience having someone telling you what to do and how to do it. And unfortunately, that becomes part of our working relationship with some people who have sight loss or who have a disability. And it's an emotional experience when it's going well, because there's a sense of elation and well-being. But there's also an emotional experience when it's not going well, and that's more difficult for us to work along with. So going back to the start of my career, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and Lucas was but a boy, there was a time when I knew very little about people with disabilities, and even less about their emotions. But I did have some people who were able to teach me to be more open to the learning that I needed to be able to answer those questions and ask questions. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Jack and Roz, because they're the two clients that I'm going to talk about, and where those questions came from that led me on to doing some further study. I should point out that most of my learning has come through my client experience. Everything I've learned in books has had to be questioned and validated by the experience of clients. Otherwise, it has no value. So the clients have taught me everything I needed to know, and I'm very grateful to them for teaching me, because I'm sure I wasn't the easiest student to instruct. So in a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit more about Jack. But first of all, I'd like you to meet Roz. And the same thing, this is a video, so please tell me if there's any problems with it.
I have retinitis pigmentosa, which is a degenerative condition and leads to blindness. I became very frightened, very, very depressed. My ophthalmologist had suggested that I speak to somebody at the RSB. Instead of running away from the condition, I had to accept where I was. And I also, it was really important to accept the RSB's help. I had quite a lot of counselling, which I needed. My life changed quite dramatically when I realised that I was eligible for an RSB guide dog. Violetta and I have a beautiful relationship. She's not only my visual companion, she's my buddy. When I got Violetta, I felt quite excited, but also very apprehensive. Because Violetta was going to be my sighted guide, I thought that I'd actually be able to see again. There was an initial period of an emotional adjustment, but she's a fabulous little dog. She's a great little listener. I kind of sat myself down and I realised that I could be vision impaired and miserable, or I could be vision impaired and have a full, rich life. So I guess I decided to get on with it and have a full, rich life. My lifestyle can change so that I can become really happy and independent regardless of how much vision I have.
So, thank you very much, Roz. I mean, that's a great video for showing the emotional connection to how things go. And just to focus on some of the points that Roz raised, she said that she was depressed and had to have counselling to deal with the depression, not just the sight loss, but the depression as well. She recognized that she could be vision impaired and miserable, or she could have a full, rich life. Both of those are extremes of an emotional scale. She eventually stated she chose to be happy and independent. Happiness, as we've discovered, is an emotional state, and independence, if that leads to happiness, can be a catalyst for emotional states as well. And then these are all emotionally driven comments, and emotions drive her actions. These are the decision making that she made because of her emotional state, as well as her sight loss. So some facts, really. So there's a study done a few years ago in the UK called DepFit, and it shows that 43% of people with a vision impairment experience depression, but are not being treated by their GP because they don't disclose that depression to their GP. And that's almost 50% of the population of people with sight loss are dealing with some level of depression. And we know that having exposure to animals helps reduce loneliness, increases feelings of social support, and boosting mood. We also know that having exposure to an animal provides social support, stress relief, and general health benefits as well. You feel better by having an animal around you, and it impacts on your health and well-being to have that animal as part of your life. And we also know, as clinical studies prove, that having an animal will reduce your suffering from depression. What we don't know is by how much, really, because depression is a very difficult measurement to take at an emotional scale. You need to do lots of what they call depression inventories to get that catalyst, and animals don't fit into that equation usually. So I'd also like to tell you a bit about Jack, because this is a bit more personal for me. But when I was a cadet guide dog instructor, or an apprentice guide dog instructor in some countries, I met a client, let's call him Jack. And Jack was in the second week of a 4-week training program, which was in those days a standard training program. He was with our first guide dog, let's call her Jill, because I'm not very creative. And then Jack and Jill were on their first night walk, which is the first experience of the client using the dog in the evening at dusk or in the late night to try and negotiate a different set of environmental stimuli. And we were about half the way around the block, and Jack just stopped dead in his tracks and burst into tears. And I do mean uncontrollable tears. And I stopped, and the dog stopped, and we all stopped together. And I tried to find my cadet manual of how to deal with people who were crying, and I couldn't find anything on any page. And then I went to my fallback position of thinking, who can I ask about this? And it was the middle of the night, so I couldn't really do it. And so I did what came naturally to me, which would probably be found on today, is I just gave him a hug. And we sat down on a park bench in the middle of a park in the middle of the night, 2 men and a dog. And we just talked about what was making him feel bad about being out for a night walk with me as an instructor and with his dog. And the things that were making him feel bad were his fear and apprehension about what was coming next. He had gone through life as a person with sight, suddenly had lost it, and was now making that adjustment. Some would say a little bit late into the experience because we'd already given him a guide dog, but he was now crossing that bridge. He understood now what stigma meant, because he had gone from being an athlete to having sight loss to using a long cane for a short while, and then having a guide dog. And people now noticed him with his guide dog, and he was now prominent in the community he was living in and in the training area where we were working. He had now come to terms with talking to his parents about his sight loss and his friends. And his greatest fear was what was going to happen in 9 years' time when this little dog, Jill, was ready to retire. Where would that leave him now? So already he was thinking about the future and the impact of that emotional journey for him going forward. And it just was overwhelming to me that he was dealing with all of these things, as well as on class trying to learn how to operate this dog safely and efficiently and effectively. And that's the learning I took from it is, you know, I needed to be better at dealing with these situations. I needed to have more than a manual of guide dog mobility to be able to talk to this gentleman about what was going on. I needed to be better prepared for those sort of events when they did come up. But how do you become prepared for that? And I needed to be better educated as to what the circumstances were around these feelings that he was experiencing if I was going to help him through them. So what I did know, because I come from a psych background, was that people experience a wide range of emotions. What I didn't know is how wide. And some of these emotions are associated with sight loss. Not all of them, but some of them are. Some of them are just adolescence and being a young man in an environment where everything's new and changed, or having everything change in your life. But some of them are sight loss related. And then some of these emotions are triggered by the whole journey of guide dog mobility, not just getting the dog, but the application process, the whole rigmarole of getting to the point where he's walking in the middle of the night with his guide dog, and what that surge of emotion has created for him. And then some of these emotions were more evident when they had their dog than before they had their dog. So there's a build-up of these different stages of emotional well-being and emotional difficulties. So I knew I had to get better at this if I was going to keep this job. And I thought, let's do a PhD. Now, I looked at other options. I thought, well, I let myself be punched in the face. I thought that was a good solution. Kiss a jellyfish, that could be an option. Love Island, I don't know if the US has Love Island, but if you don't, we should give it to you as retribution for the stuff you give us. And then I thought, well, we'll do a PhD. And where it all began was, I knew it needed to be the client's voice, and I knew it needed to be heard. And I knew it had to be a mixed qualitative and quantitative study to get that impact across. And it needed to be real. So I needed to think about case studies. And that meant getting volunteers from within my client group, because we were a young guide dog school at the time and we didn't have many clients, to be honest. So there were some known facts that I was familiar with, and these were absolute givens to me, and I was happy with them. A guide dog mobility isn't the same emotional journey for everyone. That's a fair assumption. It might not all show up on the application process, how this is going to play out, how emotional states will play out, because the application process, first of all, doesn't trigger these questions in real terms, and because some people are at different stages when they get to the application process. So it might not be as easy as it looks to just tick boxes. And then there are different emotions for different periods of the guide dog and different milestones of the guide dog journey. And at each stage of those milestones, people feel differently about the process. And I feel differently about the process, which has an impact on how people feel. Remember, I said that, you know, some of these experiences are shared experiences, but some of them are triggered by our responses to them. So, and I knew that a guide dog makes a difference, but what I didn't know was where's the evidence to that, and what difference does it make? So it needed a title, and I came up with a catchy little number of the emotions and feelings experienced by guide dog owners and the application, training, and working of their guide dogs. And the board at the university thought that was quite clever. I thought it was quite long-winded, but they were happy with it. And then I really stumbled in, can this question be answered? I decided to look at the milestones in the guide dog partnership, all except retirement or withdrawal. And I specifically left those out of this study because they are such a myriad of responses that they require their own PhD studies to look at those. And there are some PhD studies and some further articles on retirement and withdrawal that give more emphasis to those questions, because they are such complicated questions. So I went with the application process. Did people have an emotional state when they applied for a guide dog? Training, because as soon as you start training with a guide dog, that changes the dynamic. You're no longer a person without a dog waiting for a dog. You're now a person with a dog and being trained to use that dog. And that comes back to that how do you feel about people telling you what to do and how to do it question. 6 months post-qualification, because essentially we call this a honeymoon period where things are going swimmingly, potentially going swimmingly, or they're not going swimmingly, and you need to put some solutions in place to help the client and the dog get through that period. And then 12 months post-qualification, because that's pretty much when the relationship is well established. It should be ticking along quite nicely by that stage. Now, I caveat that by saying that in those last two, things can change, dynamics can change, and you may not have that honeymoon period, or you may not feel that 12 months is a reasonable period of time. I just took those as benchmarks to set up a study guideline. It's got to be a mixed method study. So I looked at qualitative because of case studies and people can tell their story, and quantitative because I needed to do a depression inventory, and I used the Beck one. There is also one called the Glasgow Depression Inventory, which if you ever lived in Glasgow, I can see why you would be depressed. But nonetheless, it's a very good depression inventory. But the Beck is one that works particularly well with people with disabilities because it asks more in-depth questions about their relationship to their disability if you trigger those questions. But it involves participants sharing their experience and their lives and their stories. And the first thing I realized is I really need to treat this with the respect it deserves. These people are giving up their lives to talk to me about their experiences and their emotions, and that should be hallowed. It was a longitudinal study, which is why it took me so long, because the 4 milestones took about 4.5 years to gather, and then I had to write it up, and I'm basically lazy, so that took just as long to write up. And then it was a very small sample group. There was 6 clients in the sample group, 8 in total, and then by the time it finished, about 10 altogether. So it was very intense periods of interviewing with these particular clients. They were very generous with their time and very enabling of me to be able to get the information I needed. And then I used the thematic analysis because you really have lots of themes evolving when you're talking about emotions. When you're talking about people feeling sad or feeling upset or feeling unhappy, you need to dig down to see why that is. You just can't say tick unhappy. So I'd started with systematic literature review, which if you've all done one, I'm sure you have, they can be fun, and they can be, if you're a nerdy bloke like me who likes looking at literature, or they can be a bane of your life. And the questions I wanted to look at was what was out there already. How many studies on guide dogs, and how many about blind and vision impaired people and guide dogs, and what the criteria was around that. And I was really quite impressed. I took off on a merry jaunt, and I did a PICA, which is sort of looking at the population intervention scales. And I came up with 972 articles on guide dogs and peoples of all sorts. And then I thought, that's not bad. And then I started filtering it down, and 574 were not much use at all because they were talking about breeding puppies, arthritic hips, eye conditions in guide dogs, the stuff that was no value to me. 82 didn't talk about the emotional connection to blind people. They did talk about blind people, but not the emotional connection to their dog. And then the worst thing was only 4 of them did talk about blind people, guide dogs, and their emotions. And that meant there was very little literature out there that asked questions about guide dogs and their emotional states. Luckily, even in the last year, there's been a few more coming out, but there's not enough. So if you're thinking about doing a PhD, I would urge you to think about this as a subject. The research question really looked at the emotional well-being, as I said, the depression and as an emotion, because it is a significant emotion, and what the impact of depression is on our client basis as they go through these milestones. And then time frames, temporality of what we're doing. Applying for and training for and working with a dog seem to be good time frames to be looking at this. And then what does it mean to us as workers? It's all very well having a nice little 600-page thesis where you can say, oh, people have got emotions, but unless it's useful to us as service providers, it's just 600 pages worth of dribble. So I thought I need to be clear about what that is. But some of the points were that emotions are important in understanding people and why they would go through this traumatic experience. And it is a traumatic experience of applying for and working with a dog. You know, if you're vision impaired and you're coping well in the world that you live with using a long cane or any other mobility aid, then why would you put yourself through it to work with a dog? There needs to be something more driving behind that. Is it external influences, family, friends, or is it internal that you feel safer with the dog, etc.? All of these things, but they all add influence, and there's times when they don't. You know, all of these emotions, they ebb and flow through the relationship that the client has with the organization, with the instructor, and even with the dog. So they all have peaks and troughs as they bubble along through life. And we all have these experiences. There's times when I feel fantastic about life, and there's times when I look at my paycheck and I'm not feeling fantastic about my life. But they all have relationships to our emotions about that. And some emotions are connected to the disability. That was the key point. Does sight loss have a real impact on people's emotional well-being? And the obvious answer to us in the profession is yes. But to somebody looking outside into the profession, you might say, well, there are things that people experience that are normal parts of life that the sight loss just adds another level to, and it may not influence at all. So, you know, if adolescence is difficult as a young adolescent, is it more complicated with sight loss? We would argue yes, because of the social relationships that sight loss creates, or doesn't create. And so really the main point about this is, what did the applicants say? What were the things that were sticking out in the research that the applicants were telling us? And so I've taken some quotes from these people, and they always move me when I read them, because they're just so real in terms of the things that we would experience. So one of the older clients, Max, said that he was going to be this dog that was coming. Remember, this dog hasn't arrived yet. Its application was going to be his buddy and his partner, because he didn't have anybody else in the world. Literally nobody else in the world. And this dog was going to be a savior or a catalyst for him living his life again. Bill was deeply emotional about his sight loss and his journey to the application process, and just said, I can't cry anymore, I'm done. And he meant it. He just had nothing left in his emotional tank to bring to the relationship. One of the clients I interviewed was paying his cleaning lady to stay around for 30 minutes to have a cup of tea just for the company, because he was so isolated for the rest of the week. And these are the people that have an emotional connection to their sight loss, but also an emotional connection to social isolation, to loneliness. These are all emotional states as well. And then Stan said he was a middle-aged gentleman, quite tall, but he was worried about how people would perceive him when he traveled outside, if he bumped into things, the emotional embarrassment about bumping into things or being exposed and embarrassed when he did something that would only happen because he didn't have any sight. And that progressed on to training. One of the ladies interviewed, it was very clear she needed a dog that was going to be a super dog, because she wasn't coping emotionally with the world around her, and she wanted a dog that was able to just sort of take the world by the horns, as it were, and just help her get into routines and be the person she wanted to be, because she didn't have the internal strength to do it. Bill, once again, saying Bill reported that he was worried about his future sight loss, because what was it going to be like when he couldn't see anything at all? He already had severe sight loss, but when he was totally blind and he knew it was coming, he would have rather been any other disability than lost his sight. And everybody says that, I'd rather be deaf or blind, I'd rather be deaf or mute. But the reality is that for some people, that's not a choice. You will lose your sight, and that creates an emotional catalyst for fear and anxiety. And And at 6 months after they've had the dog, Max, of course, has got his dog. He's very happy with this little bitch that he's got called Holly, and she's his mate. It's his best pals. They're getting around. They're doing really well. They're growing in the relationship, and it's all going swimmingly. Bill reported not so much. That 75% of the time, his little dog Nancy was doing really well, but 25, he was literally at his wit's end because this dog was just challenging him at every opportunity, and his frustration levels, another emotion, were going through the roof. His fear about being seen in public with this dog that wasn't doing well, and he felt his relationship with the dog was struggling. And then Max came back with a little pearl from that said he'd be lost if he was to lose the dog now. So there's already a fear and anxiety about the future, about when this dog potentially wouldn't be with him. But what is also hidden in that sentence is there's a disempowerment that goes on at an emotional level that he's now subject to review from people like myself as a guide dog instructor who have the power over his relationship with his dog. And that's a mighty disempowerment to be facing if somebody else can take your dog away after you built this relationship with it. So, and then 12 months is, as I said, 12 months is pretty much when you're hoping things are ticking along nicely. Oh, excuse me. Bob said that if he didn't have his dog, that he'd feel that there's something missing. That's a real emotional statement about not being complete without having his dog alongside him, and almost a veiled warning to the instructor or the interviewer that please don't take my dog from me. Todd, one of the other applicants we haven't talked about, he was initially very fearful about walking with his dog, walking without a dog. People would stop him and ask him about his sight loss, and he would just be petrified about answering that. And the dog was a social conduit. The dog was able to break down those barriers between him and his other world, and he felt like he was being much more normal. And Gwen, the lady that was having lots of anxiety, I should point out, she had PTSD as well. This little dog that she was given was a super dog, and it did open up her world for her, and it did all the things that she was too fearful to do by herself. And she says that the dog gave her courage. Now, that's a huge responsibility to put onto a dog, really, but that's how she felt. And what do we do about that relationship when somebody says that everything is now hinged on the success of the relationship with the dog? Do we gear them up for that end of the relationship? Do we start planting the seed? Or do we build on it and improve her confidence alongside the relationship she's got with the dog? These are all emotional questions. So some reality checks for me. Excuse me, I'll have a little drink. Having a guide dog is not the answer to all the solutions or all the questions that about these problems. Some of them are so deeply entrenched in emotional well-being that they're never going to be answered by just having a dog. For some people, having a dog may cause more emotions to surface. Fear that, Bill said it when his dog wasn't working well. I'm frustrated and angry about this, and what do I do with that? Where do I put that frustration and anger? I can't put it onto the dog because the relationship breaks down even further. For some people, it changes their life to the positive. There's no doubt people do feel better about it. And for some people, like my little friend Jack at the beginning of the conversation, he pointed out that he felt more vulnerable. It created a stigma for him because he was now not just Jack the athlete, but now he was now Jack the blind athlete with a guide dog. And the question still bubbles along is, do people with sight loss feel differently than people with sight? And the answer is still yes, but how at an emotional level? How does that work? So there were some positives, and I will highlight them. For some people, having a guide dog may open up opportunities that weren't there before. So it allows them to be like Todd, more socially interactive, able to challenge themselves to do more social things. It may be improving their health or their state and fitness. That's a given. It may help them deal with their emotions better. There are so many stories of clients that talk to their dogs rather than talk to other people, and use the dog as a confidant, as a sounding board for problems that are going on with them. The dog listens, and one of the interviewees said, the best thing about it doesn't answer back. Well, that may not be the perfect solution, but at least it's a sounding board where people can vent their frustrations and their conversation pieces. It may improve their lives and independence. In some cases, it may not. If the dog is unwell or the dog's not working well, that creates a whole new set of worries at an emotional level and challenges independence. Some people felt that they weren't worthy of a guide dog, and that really surprised me, because I've heard it a few times through my career where, oh no, somebody else who's more blind than me should have the dog. And it says a lot about the way that we as a profession put levels of that relationship onto applying for a dog, that the criteria is what makes people worry about whether they're worthy. And some people are very aware of their emotional states. Oh, I'm such a mess at the moment. I'm not sure if I should be doing this, or I've been a mess for so many years. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to cope with a dog. And maybe they're right. Who knows? Some people worried about being judged because of their emotional state. And you're just going to think I'm just a bag of nerves, or you're just going to think I'm not together. And then some people felt judged, which is a reflection on us as professionals, and that worried me even more. People shouldn't feel that we are there to judge them as part of the process of applying for or having a dog. They were incredibly anxious about visits from staff and the form filling in, because once again, we are seen to be the empowerers. We are empowered to make decisions about their relationships. They either get a dog because we make a decision, or they don't get a dog because we make a decision, or they can keep their dog because we make a decision, and they have some input into that, but at the end of the day, not as much as they would like. And this raised more questions for me. I'm good at asking questions, I'm maybe not good at answering them. So just going back to what that research looked like, does having a dog contribute to emotional well-being? Yeah. Amazingly, even when the dog wasn't working well, they still felt emotionally better for having the dog, which raises the question is, which is more value, the dog's work as a guide dog or the dog being a dog? Lots of research into that. Does depression have a significant impact on emotional well-being? Well, interestingly, across the study and the 4 milestones, the longer they had the dog, the more the depression eased off. And even when they were having episodes that would previously trigger depression, the presence of the dog made it more bearable and the depression lesser, according to the depression scale that we used. And temporality of emotional well-being, those 4 milestones, every time that we went through a milestone, companionship kept popping up, and increased confidence was reducing their anxiety, depression. So across the 4 milestones, people got better and their anxiety reduced and their depression reduced. But it wasn't because the dog was working well as a guide dog. It was because the dog was working well as a companion and somebody to talk to. And then how does that work for us, as service providers? Well, when the clients are in a much better headspace and emotional space, our role is made significantly easier, and we can have difficult conversations when people are in a better space to hear them. When they're at that height of emotional distress, they won't listen to what we're saying, and more so, we shouldn't be trying to tell them what we're saying when they're in that state. We should be putting some supports in place to reduce that anxiety and fear and depression, and then tackle the conversations that are difficult. You can't be beating your head against a wall trying to get a message across if the person isn't receptive to hearing the message. So how does the dog impact on emotions? Well, it does, because the dog has the same emotional connection with the people all through their journey. You know, if the dog is working well, everything's tickety-boo. If it's not working well, that creates an emotional difficulty. If the dog at training is working well, that makes the relationship between the instructor and the client work well, because the client feels that the dog is a showpiece or an extension to themselves. And if they're getting praise for working well with the dog, then the dog is working well. And then finally, as they go through their own lives, if the dog is finding destinations, if the dog is helping them deal with the sight loss that they've been experiencing more so than any other mobility aid, then their confidence is coming up at all stages. So the good bits are that when they're first introduced to the dog, everything is wonderful. It's rare that you introduce the dog to the client in their bedroom that there's not tears, usually from me, but usually the relationship starts off on that introduction, and it's always a positive one. I've rarely seen a dog that goes into the room and then just walks straight over and says, "No, I'm not having this. I don't want to talk to this person." They usually interact. When they first start working with the dog, there's a real connection there. You know, there's a sense of achievement. The client's emotional receptors are up and they're feeling good about it. And then when they first start to bond and trust the dog, which is different from when they first start to work with the dog, the bond and trust really starts to create that relationship that is testable by time and by experience. If there's something, you know, usually something like traffic training, if the dog has done a particularly good traffic session, that's almost an invitation to say to the client, "Oh, you know, this dog can do what I think it can do and keep me safe." The downsides really are pretty there, as the client said. When a dog isn't working well, that's traumatic and it's emotionally challenging for everyone in the relationship. When the dog can't work, if it's sick, that's really traumatic. People don't cope with that well, and they don't know what to do with that emotional upset that they get when the dog's not working well. They're not vets, they can't fix it, they just have to deal with it. More so when the dog is removed, and that's for whatever reason the dog is removed, that's incredibly traumatic. And as instructors, we should be better at signposting, and we should be cognizant of the need to signpost people onto support if we are going to be the catalyst for removing the dog. I'm not going to mention about when, you know, withdrawals and death of a dog, but that's obviously very traumatic for people. And then the other one that really crops up irregularly is when they can't get another dog. Sometimes the client, it just isn't in the right space to get a replacement dog. And they might be too old, they might be too frail, 100 reasons why they might not get another dog. But that is incredibly emotionally draining for people when you turn around to them as the instructor and you say, "You're just not going to get another dog from us." And then the panic sets in about what's next, you know, especially if they're still mobile and they want to get out and be independent. How? If they haven't used a cane for 7 years, or they haven't used it well for 7 years, they have a whole lot of fears and anxieties. So we need to understand people's emotional states and everything they do with the service, with the staff, with the dog particularly, but also with volunteers, because volunteers have a huge impact on it too. And, you know, sometimes we create relationships with the clients and the volunteers that stand the test of time, but also create emotional ties. In some schools, there's almost not an insistence, but there's an expectation that the client will interact with the puppy raisers and, you know, have a sort of a "thank you very much for saving my life with the dog." I'm not saying that's how it's perceived, but sometimes that relationship is triggered by the needs of the volunteers and by the needs of the organization who need to keep volunteers. So we need to be careful about how we manage that at an emotional level. But it's okay to do that. You know, you just need to be good at managing it. We need to understand that people's emotional needs are part of the work with their dog, and the dog plays a large part of that. As I said, if it's not working well, it's everybody's issue, not just the client and the dogs. Everybody needs to take a hand in it. The organization's response to that needs to be prompt, and it needs to be effective. That's okay too. We need to understand where we can or can't help. Sometimes these things are too big for us as instructors, and we need to be careful about how we manage it, because the future relationship the client has with the dog depends on how well we manage it at the point of acknowledgement. When the client says, I'm not coping with this, what can I do? It's okay to deal with that. So we need to be better at asking questions and interview and assess people for a guide dog. And this is the points I'm going to make about our processes. We need to be better at planning and supporting people at times when their emotions are most active and impactful, such as when they're applying for and training with a guide dog. Funny, that should be a subject of a thesis. But they also, that has an impact when things like aftercares are due, or if there's a problem with the relationship with the dog. Clients that we interviewed 12 months were petrified of aftercares, and I don't know why that is. You know, I never start a conversation with a client saying, I'm coming out to do your aftercare. I usually start it with something as low-key as, put the kettle on, I'm going to have a cup of tea with you, and we'll talk about how things are going. The minute you use technical jargon with the client, their fear factors go up and their emotions trigger in with that. So be careful about the language you use. And as I said, I didn't go into it, but when the relationship's coming to an end, that's a traumatic period. And we're getting better at planning that in our industry, where we're now saying, you know, a long time before the dog is due to retire, there's a lead-in time to those conversations. But how soon is too soon is the question that we all ask. And when we can't give them another dog, that's very traumatic for people. So where do you find all this on your interview and application forms? Well, the simple truth is you don't, because it's not there. And you can't, because it will never be there. Because interview and application forms are designed to gather snippets of information. It's really just an icebreaker. It shouldn't be used as the be-all and end-all for making a decision. You should have lots of engaging conversations with people. You need to ask more questions than name, address, height, weight, and email address. There's so much more depth to the client that you need to know about at an emotional level and at a functional level that you won't get if you're just ticking boxes. You need to understand their journey, what has brought them to the front door of our organization with the question, can I have a guide dog? Because if you don't ask them that question, then really everything you're gathering as information is going to be null and banal. There won't be anything in it that's of value to you. We need to understand how they're feeling and how these feelings and emotions are going to react when we are dealing with them on other things. Because if they're raising emotional issues for you at the start of conversations, that's going to continue on in the relationship. And when things get tough, the tough get going, but the emotions rise and ebb with those too. We need to understand if we are triggering those emotions in people. As I said, aftercare has an incredible effect on people at an emotional level. And if you go into it thinking, I'm here to do aftercare and I've got a tick box form as to how well you're going to go, and that will decide whether you keep your dog, you're in trouble from the second you walk in the door. So we need to develop skills as staff. We need to be better at what we do. So have a look at application forms and see if it does. I've read a couple, and some of them are really, you know, I look at them now and I think 20 years ago you would have got away with it. Now in today's enlightened society, probably not. Things like, do you have a mental illness? Yes or no? Well, really? Is that going to help you? Have you had psychological treatment in the past 12 months? Define psychological treatment. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that you need to be better at doing it. We need to be better at being person-centered, involving people in the conversations that we're having with them and centering them as part of the revolving circle of information that we gather. Yeah, you need to listen. My mother, who was Irish, by the way, 5'1", 6'3" with her mouth open, said, "You've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. That should be the ratio." And she's probably right. We need to understand emotions and when those questions, when they come up, and what our questions are doing to raise those emotions, and be careful about asking questions that are emotive, that create more issues. Diffusion and dealing with issues is better than continually creating problems for the client. So, yeah. Here's some examples of what people have put on forms, and I gathered these from around the world, so I'm not blaming one particular organization. This is a classic one, isn't it, really? Might need a more sensitive dog. Okay, that's not the best answer you're getting on the form. Here's a perfect one. Very angry man, not suitable for a guide dog. No real solution as to why the person might be angry. It might well be because the instructor is saying you're a very angry man. So that needs to be challenged. Very upset at the loss of previous guide dog due to illness. Worried this might happen again. Do not accept until feeling better about future outcome. Oh, well, that's easy. That's solved then, isn't it? That's an easy fix. It gets worse. Has been blind all his life. Tried to commit suicide last year. Seems quite happy now. Accept. And then the worst of the worst. Applicant is batshit crazy. First of all, to put that on a form should be heading you to the unemployment line straight away. But secondly, to make such a value and judgment call about a person who's just emotionally expressing themselves just seems to be, I don't know how you do it. Anyway, so that's examples. What we need to do, educate our staff, please. Let's get better at it. Educate our clients. They need to be part of that process too. They need to know where boundaries are and what we will accept as staff, but also what we were able to help with. Volunteers, as I mentioned. Puppy raisers are part of this whole journey. So are boarders. So is everybody that ever deals with a client's dog. And then we need to upskill ourselves all the time, knowing when and how to act. And don't limit our learning. It's not just about safeguarding. If a client tells you something in confidence, sometimes it's to understand your understanding of what they're saying, not just to put the fear of God in you about who gets to know about this. You know, there are safeguarding issues, and then there's emotional discussions as well. But the key to this is we don't all have to be psychologists or counselors, but we do have to be person-centered. You do have to understand the relationship the client has with the organization, with you as a staff member, with their dog, and you need to be able to balance that triad very efficiently to be able to do what we do. And that's why we do what we do so well. Okay, so a couple of other points, just simply about the study. I acknowledge the secondary role of guide dogs. It's not just about guide dogs guiding people to and from destinations. Their role as companions is absolutely of the highest priority. And as I said before, some clients will accept a bad guide dog for a good pet dog. That's the wrong dynamic to me, but it still needs to be addressed. Clients will tolerate poor performance in a dog in exchange for companionship. They shouldn't have to. You should be giving them the best quality guide dog and the best quality companion. That's just an aspirational thing. You need to work out, you know, for the applicant, if guide dog is unsuccessful, what the emotional fallout for that is, and you need to plan for that. You need to have signposting in place. You need to have specialists on hand, not us, because we're not psychologists, but you need to be able to refer your clients on with a sense of loyalty to that client, because they've disclosed this knowledge to you, their emotional state, and we need to deal with it. You need to give people freedom to express their emotions. Now, not to the point where they're ranting and raving. There are boundaries to that, but we need to give them the freedom to be able to talk. And then we need to value their contribution to the partnership. We see the dog once a year on an aftercare visit. They have the dog 24/7. Excuse me. Organizations need to be good at getting in touch with people. Don't leave them sitting stewing on issues. The longer you leave them stewing on issues, the issue blows out of proportion and the emotional response goes with it. Don't see characters in a text box as the end of the conversation. Dig deeper every time. And don't use ticks in the box as a job done. That's it. Job done. We know where we are. Use it as a starting point. Okay, and there's my favorite. Don't see our clients as the bit on the end of the dog's lead. It's a relationship. You know, the relationship between the client and the dog is an emotional one at every opportunity. And when you step into that, whether you step in as a mobility instructor, as a guide dog instructor, or as any other instructor or technical person, you create a triad, you create a relationship that needs to have three elements to it. Okay, so it's a big decision to have a dog. There's lots of hurdles to overcome, even before they come to the door. It could be their friends and family that are making these decisions for them. You need to get to the bottom of that. Yeah. You need to understand what the interaction is with your organization. And then for some people, it's just the start of their sight loss. You may have them for 20 or 30 years, and they'll be changing every time. If they've had 4 dogs from you, the dog they started with isn't going to be the dog they finish with. And for some people, it's just too hard. So yeah, we need to be thinking about all these things. So I would suggest that we do lots more person-centered research, that you use your application form wisely. It's a good tool for starting a conversation. It's not a good tool for ending a conversation. You develop the skills we mentioned, and we go through educational learning at every opportunity. And more importantly, you hire a recently graduated PhD with a Scottish accent to come and talk about this all day long, and I'm happy to. Okay, I've put lots of references in this presentation for you because I think it's worthwhile doing the extra reading, but it's there if you want it. And then finally, I asked one of my clients to send me a picture of them and their guide dog that it would be happy putting on a presentation. And this is what happens when you ask a blind man to take a photo of his dog on a phone. You get that. But the point is quite well made because both the photo and the presentation have come to the end. Thank you very much for your time and for listening. And please, if you've got any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for that. Certainly from a guide dog instructor's point of view, a lot of things came up, and I think we have enough people here that if you have a question, we won't use chat. We'll just raise your hand if you know how to do that on your computer, and I'll call on you. But let me just start off by first of all thanking Chris, and secondly, the term signposting is one I wasn't completely familiar with, and I'd love to have an explanation of what you meant by that.
Sure. Signposting, my definition of signposting is where you reach a point where you can't do any more, but there are other professionals in the organization or outside the organization that you can refer that client onto. Now, we do it quite often if we need OT support or if we need physiotherapy support for people who have got other disabilities, and we would signpost that person to that other professional. It's a bit like, I'm trying to think of your American football term, but it's a bit like holding the ball and passing it effectively. If the client is the ball, you don't want to fumble that relationship. You want that handover to be as smooth and as precise so the client doesn't feel disenfranchised by the experience, that the client feels that there's a continuum to what you're doing. The instructor can't deal with me at the moment, but they've got somebody who can fix up my gait or fix up my fear and anxieties if it's a psychologist you send them to. But the end of the picture is that you get a well-rounded and a holistic approach to the service model. So that's my definition of signposting efficiently and effectively.
Great.
I hope it's all yours.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much. One of the other things that struck me, and we have instructors here from Leader Dog and Guide Dogs for the Blind, and myself. I don't know everybody else, maybe, and we also have mobility instructors. So I'd love to hear what your reaction to Chris's presentation. And it's interesting too because the whole ownership issue it comes up in this, because in the schools that Chris is talking about, in most cases, the school owns the dog, and so there is this withdrawal question that the school can withdraw a dog, and that's not universally true. Also, schools are always reluctant to do that, or most always. So let's see. I think I had a question here. Yeah, no, not a question, but I'd love to hear other instructors' reactions and mobility instructors' reactions to this presentation.
This is Eileen. I had a question, Chris. In doing your research, did you check the variable between the applicant who has a significant other and the applicant that might be single?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. And yes, I did. I did dynamics. I did a sort of spider graph of dynamics, and to a T to each client. Like, remember, it's a small sample group. The clients that were more isolated, more lonely, not obviously, but let's assume for the sake of a thesis that there's no such thing as an assumed hypothesis. But regardless, clients who were more isolated, more insular, were in most cases more depressed, more anxious, more worried about the application process, because the application process was the gateway to being less isolated, less insular. If you had a significant other or a family dynamic, that was a fallback position for most people. So yeah, the dynamics of interaction socially has a big play in decision making for some people about getting a guide dog. To be fair, though, I just want to make the other point, is that in my initial pilot study, one of the applicants felt bullied into applying for a guide dog because of the relationship they had with the family and the family's reluctance to take responsibility for that person any further and their sight loss. And that relationship with the dog failed.
Yeah.
So it was
I often wondered that with a single person, having that guide dog then becomes a very major relationship. And if you were married or had a significant other, if there was a conflict, once the dog sort of entered into the tripod, becoming three rather than two. Yeah,
there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence about the dog being the center point of divorce, because the relationship now hinges on the client, and for some partners in the relationship, there's a sense of now it's an interesting one, because in some relationships, that sense of supporting your client and their vision impairment through the relationship is quite a codependency relationship. There's quite a lot of it. You put a dog in between that's supposed to take care of somebody's well-being and to keep them safe, and that creates conflict, because you end up with a relationship that potentially has now got a third party in it. And some people deal with that really well. They deal with it, well, great, it's all yours, take the responsibility and go forth. And some people feel very aggrieved about the fact they're no longer of equal value to the relationship with the dog. So, as I said, emotions are funny things. People have different dynamics across the whole gamut of them.
Well, I imagine that as an instructor, sometimes not recognizing that as having a dynamic with what's happening during training. I mean, I think you'd have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, try and find that on the application form.
Yeah, right.
And again, instructors, first of all, we come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but as Chris talked about in his presentation, number one, when he started, he was very young, and so he as were most of us anyway, and so our life experience, we couldn't perform above our life experience. We got life experience from the training process, and in Chris's weird case, it led to a PhD. And most of us, we just get we think more about it. I hope, and get better at it, more sensitive as we grow. But you can't help but start as a young person. We could, and this is something that we've been talking about, we could do a better job of educating cadets and apprentices about the emotions involved in this process. And I think that's something that certainly is beginning to, partly because of Chris's work, largely because of Chris's work, beginning to get some attention and direction in the guide dog field.
I totally agree with you, Lucas. I think that, experience is a great educator, but the more you soften the fall for young instructors by giving them a previous education or giving them some learning materials to relate to, then the better they're going to be at hopefully the better they're going to be at not falling into the pitfalls of trying to look in the guide dog manual to see what to do when somebody's crying. There's nothing in that manual to deal with. I reached into my pocket and all I found was a poo bag. I had nothing. And that education that we're talking about for young instructors of every discipline is vitally important. Now that we know that emotional connection with the client is just as important as the matching process or the aftercare visit or leash control, whatever it is, it's just as important in understanding the client. That's a conversation killer, isn't it?
No, not at all.
Yeah, the other question I have, I don't mean to be asking all the questions, but as an orientation and mobility specialist, I've been asked on occasion to write a letter of recommendation. I don't know if that's part of every school's application to have letters of reference. And I was often sort of confused as to what type of information was really being asked. I mean, I could report on their orientation mobility skills as I saw them with using the long cane. But as sometimes because I had information on family dynamics or a temperamental type stuff, I was rather hesitant sometimes of giving an opinion as to how that would have an impact on their working with the guide dog.
Do you know, Eileen, it's a classic example of what Lucas is talking about in terms of signposting. What you're doing is adding information into the equation that makes the decision-making process further down the line more concrete and based in observational fact. If you're talking about the dynamic in the relationship, as long as you're keeping it as an observational, as an objective viewpoint, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be incorporated into a report. And being person-centered, you would write that report, that section of the report, in conjunction with the conversation with the client. If you've asked me for a referral report to pass on to a guide dog school, here's the things I'm going to say. You get on really well with your wife. You have a great support network. The kids are fantastic. You're working, 40 hours a week. They're all important facts that on an application form would end up being a tick box. Mm-hmm. And, that background information gives depth to the conversation that the instructor should be having further down the line. Hey, Eileen says that you've got a great relationship with your wife and you're both working and you've got great kids. What's your kids' names? You find more information about having inconsequential conversations with the client than you will ever do by asking your age, weight, and height.
Thanks, Chris.
Right. Well,
excuse me.
You're right.
Yeah, old.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Eileen, especially for the questions from the mobility community. Other mobility instructors, what's your experience been with the application and follow-up process? If you have any thoughts there, I'd love to hear them.
It's interesting. I'm working with a client right now who has just applied to dog school, and he's excited about it. I think I'm going to ask him more questions the next time I see him, and really dig into why he really wants this dog. And, what are you going to do with it? How do you see it in the future? Some of the things that you discussed. And then I have a new client that's also interested in getting a dog, but I haven't seen him in a while, so I'm not sure how far he is in the process. But this was really informative. So I work with a lot of people who have guide dogs. So this is real helpful. Thanks.
Glad to be of help.
Terrific. All right. I think we'll wind this down. As I said, I'm going to stop the recording in a second, and if I don't screw this up, I will, which I have done before, so I know whereof I speak. I will get this into we have Chris, just so you know, we have a live binder site. I don't know if you know Live Binder, but yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And so this will go up in a Live Binder link sometime in the next couple of days. I have no excuse. I'm retired now, so I can't say I'm too busy. So I should be able to get it up unless I screw it up. So
this always happens with my OMI colleagues. Is you always make us look like we're just crawling out of the Plasticine era mire. You've got all this great tech and stuff that you work with. I got 4 legs and a poo bag.
Yeah. Well, we've all spent a lot of time looking at the south end of northbound dogs. So there you go. All right, guys. Thanks very much, Eileen. Thanks for helping us put this together, and Meredith, Kristen for setting this up. All of you for coming. Will for the musical accompaniment, and and we'll see you all shortly. Thanks very much for coming, Chris. Thanks so much for doing it.
Thank you, Chris. I really
Thank you
enjoyed
very
it.
much.
Thanks,
doing this.
Chris.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Lovely
it.
to meet you. Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Lucas.
Well, it was wonderful. Good presentation.
Yes, thanks, Lucas.
Sure.